1942, 500 middle-aged family men from Hamburg were given a choice. Step forward and shoot unarmed civilians, or quietly walk away with no punishment. Almost all chose to kill. How did ordinary neighbors, shopkeepers, truck drivers, fathers, become the architects of mass murder, shooting 1,500 people in a single day and 83,000 over 18 months? This is not a story of Nazi fanatics, but of Reserve Police Battalion 101. Proof that, under the right social pressure, the line between decent citizen and mass killer can vanish overnight. The answer to how ordinary men became Nazi mass murderers is more disturbing and urgent than you think. Reserve Police Battalion 101 was not made up of zealots or hardened criminals. Most of its 500 members came from Hamburg's working-class neighborhoods. Men who had spent their lives as shopkeepers, truck drivers, dock workers, or clerks. The average age was 39. Many had families waiting for them back home, children who knew them as fathers, wives who expected them to return to civilian life once the war was over. Their uniforms, pressed and official, hid the fact that most had never fired a weapon in anger. Few had any military experience at all. Many joined the police force for reasons that had nothing to do with ideology. Some wanted a steady paycheck. Others hoped for career advancement, or simply responded to the draft. Party membership was rare among the rank and file. For most, the Nazi Party was a distant authority, not a personal cause. Their lives before the war revolved around neighborhood associations, church groups, and local unions. They shared the rhythms of ordinary German life: Sunday meals, factory shifts, children's birthdays. Within the battalion, these men brought their old social bonds with them. Some had known each other for years, living on the same streets or working side by side in Hamburg's docks and warehouses. These ties shaped the battalion's sense of cohesion. They were not strangers thrown together by chance, but neighbors and colleagues who shared jokes, memories, and the habits of everyday life. Their officers, too, were often older men, store managers, small business owners, or retired civil servants who had volunteered or been called up late. Even the battalion's commander, Major Wilhelm Trapp, was a career policeman with a reputation for being approachable and fatherly, not fanatical. The men's ordinariness was reinforced by the world they left behind. Letters home described homesickness, boredom, and the longing for familiar comforts. Few expressed hatred or radical beliefs. Instead, their correspondence focused on mundane worries: the health of a child, the price of meat, the hope that the war would soon end and life would return to normal. In the early months of their deployment, Battalion 101's duties were routine: guarding railways, patrolling villages, rounding up forced laborers. Most men believed their service would be limited to police work, far from the front lines. There was little in their backgrounds to suggest what would come. Yet, beneath this surface of normalcy, the battalion's close-knit structure and shared civilian past laid the groundwork for a different kind of loyalty. One based not on ideology, but on the powerful need to belong. In the months ahead, these ordinary bonds would be tested in ways few could have imagined. At dawn on July 13, 1942, the men of Reserve Police Battalion 101 gathered in a semicircle outside the village of Josefhof. Major Wilhelm Trapp, 53 years old, stood before them. His hands shook as he delivered the orders. Every able-bodied Jewish man would be sent to a labor camp. The rest, women, children, the elderly, were to be shot on the spot. Trapp's voice faltered. Witnesses remembered tears rolling down his cheeks. He told his men this was not a task he wanted. He spoke of bombs falling on German cities, of orders from above, of duty. But then, in a moment almost unheard of among Nazi commanders, he offered a choice. Anyone who, for reasons of conscience, did not feel up to the task could step out. No threats, no warnings, just a pause, and the silence of hundreds of men staring at the ground. Out of 500, only 10 or 12 men moved. Some stepped forward immediately, their faces pale. Others hesitated, looking at their boots, before quietly joining the small group. There was no shouting, no punishment. The men who refused were simply reassigned to guard duty or logistical tasks. Later, during post-war trials, one refuser recalled, "I stepped out. No one stopped me, threatened me, or called me a coward. I was simply sent to guard duty." The rest remained. Some gripped their rifles with trembling hands. Others looked to their friends, waiting for someone else to break ranks. But the great majority, nearly every man, stayed in line. For them, the fear of standing apart, of being singled out, was stronger than the horror of what came next. Trapp himself did not supervise the killings. He spent most of the day in the village, weeping openly, repeating to those who would listen, "If this Jewish business is ever avenged on earth, then have mercy on us Germans." By noon, the massacre had begun. Men were sent in squads to the forest, each assigned a victim. They were told to shoot at close range, aiming at the back of the neck. The first shots rang out among the trees. Some men vomited or broke down, but the killing continued. For those who had stepped out, the relief was mixed with shame. They stood on the periphery, listening to the gunfire, knowing their friends were becoming something different in those woods. That day, the battalion murdered approximately 1,500 Jewish civilians. The line between ordinary men and killers had been crossed, not by force, but by a choice made in the open, with no punishment for refusal. The silence that followed Trapp's offer lingered long after the gunfire stopped. The men who stayed behind in the forest of Yosefov that day faced a reality no training had prepared them for. Each was paired with a victim, ordered to fire a single shot at the base of the skull. The killings were up close and personal. No distance, no anonymity. As the first bodies fell, something broke inside many of them. Witnesses described men stumbling away from the execution site, hands shaking, some collapsing to their knees and vomiting in the undergrowth. Others wept openly, unable to look at what they had done. The smell of blood and gunpowder clung to their uniforms. Officers watched this unraveling and responded with a different kind of preparation. Vodka and schnapps were handed out, bottles passed down the line with the unspoken promise of relief. Before the next round of shootings, men were told to chase away the taste with a drink. Alcohol became a shield, numbing nerves and blurring what was happening. It was not just a personal crutch, but a group ritual, drinking together before and after, sharing bottles as a way to rejoin the group and push down the horror. One man later recalled, "Without the schnapps, I couldn't have done it." At first, the killings left many sick. Some asked to be reassigned or hesitated to return to the line. But as the weeks passed and new actions followed, the shock faded. Shooting became routine. The rituals of drinking and camaraderie replaced the early signs of distress. Men who had once retched at the sight of blood now lined up quietly, waiting for orders. The battalion's leaders, seeing this adaptation, kept the alcohol flowing and spoke less about the nature of the work. The group's silence grew heavier, broken only by the clink of bottles and the mechanical pace of their assignments. Testimonies from these men, decades later, described the change with a kind of numbness. Some remembered the first day in vivid detail, the faces, the screams, the overwhelming urge to run. But most could not recall individual victims or even the number of times they fired their rifles. The violence had become a job, and the rituals around it, a way to survive from one day to the next. In this atmosphere, the boundaries of what was possible shifted. What had once seemed unthinkable became, over time, just another part of their daily routine. On August 18, 1942, the village of Lamazi became the site of a massacre that would stain the record of Reserve Police Battalion 101. At the center stood Lieutenant Heinz Gnade, a man whose pre-war life gave no hint of what was to come. He was 48, a career policeman, known in Hamburg as reliable but unremarkable. In Poland, he would become infamous for cruelty that shocked even hardened SS men. That morning, the battalion's orders were clear. Round up the Jewish population, separate out those fit for labor, and kill the rest. Gnade was not content to follow the script. He arrived already drinking, his breath thick with schnapps. Witnesses later described how he strutted through the village, pistol in hand, barking orders and swinging his whip. He beat victims with the flat of his weapon, herding families into the square with blows and curses. When the shooting began, Gnade did not stand back. He moved among the men, shouting at them to hurry, to shoot faster, to stop wasting time. The violence was no longer just a duty. It became a contest, a display of dominance. Subordinates recalled Gnade taunting his men, daring them to prove themselves less squeamish than the SS. He singled out those who hesitated, mocking them for weakness. Some men, desperate to avoid his ridicule, tried to outdo one another in savagery. The massacre spiraled into chaos. Children and the elderly were not spared. Gnade, drunk and relentless, beat victims senseless before ordering their execution. When the pace slowed, he waved his pistol and screamed at his men to keep up. The air filled with gunfire, shouts, and the cries of the dying. Survivors remembered Gnade's face twisted with rage, his uniform stained with sweat and dust. He drank openly throughout the day, passing bottles among the men. Alcohol was both weapon and reward, a tool to numb, a prize for obedience. By evening, the ground was littered with bodies. More than 1,700 Jews had been killed in a single day. Gnade, once an ordinary officer, had become something else entirely. A man who not only accepted brutality, but demanded it, and led others to compete in cruelty. His transformation revealed how quickly the boundaries of violence could dissolve, and how ordinary men could become more ruthless than the monsters they once feared. Peer pressure, not ideology, kept the men of Reserve Police Battalion 101 in line. After the first massacre, it became clear that the greatest fear was not punishment from above, but isolation from one's own group. Refusing to take part meant stepping out in front of friends and neighbors, admitting in public that you were too weak or too soft for the job everyone else was doing. No one wanted to be the odd man out. Testimonies from post-war trials show that men who did refuse were not jailed, beaten, or sent to the front. They were simply reassigned. Yet the act of refusal carried a different kind of weight, the silent judgment of the group. In the barracks and on the march, those who opted out felt the sting of being set apart. Some described a sense of shame that lingered for weeks, even years. Others spoke of the invisible wall that went up around them, a barrier stronger than any official order. This dynamic is not unique to the past. Modern research into group behavior, from social psychology experiments to the study of online mobbing, shows how quickly people will conform to group norms, even when those norms turn toxic. The need to belong, to avoid standing alone, can override personal morals. In digital spaces, people join in harassment or pile-ons, not out of deep conviction, but because the fear of being singled out feels worse than the act itself. The same mechanism operated in the battalion. As the killings continued, the group's silence and shared rituals made it harder to speak up, easier to go along. Responsibility was spread thin. When everyone participates, no one feels fully accountable. The men told themselves they had no choice. But records show the real force was the quiet, relentless pressure to remain part of the group. This is the engine that drove ordinary men to keep killing, long after the first shock had faded. 83,000 lives ended at the hands of Reserve Police Battalion 101. In just 18 months, 500 men from Hamburg shot 38,000 Jews and forced another 45,000 onto trains bound for Treblinka. The numbers defy comprehension. But each victim was a person with a name, a family, a life erased. These deaths were not the work of a handful of fanatics. They were carried out by neighbors, co-workers, and fathers who, step by step, learned to kill as part of their daily routine. After the war, the question of justice hung over Germany. For decades, most of these men returned to ordinary lives, their pasts hidden behind silence and denial. It was not until the late 1960s that the Hamburg courts brought 14 members of the battalion to trial. These were not just nameless functionaries, but officers and non-commissioned leaders identified through survivor testimony and wartime records. 5 were convicted of murder, with 1 sentenced to life in prison. Others received shorter terms or were acquitted for lack of evidence. The vast majority, over 95%, never faced prosecution at all. During the trials, a common defense surfaced. The claim that refusal meant certain death, that orders left no room for choice. But court records and eyewitness accounts told a different story. Testimonies showed that men who stepped out before the shootings were simply reassigned, not punished. The judges concluded that participation was voluntary, not compelled by threat of execution. The court's verdict rejected the myth of coercion, exposing the reality that ordinary men had the power to say no, and most chose not to. The scale of the crime and the limited reckoning that followed remains a stark warning about the dangers of conformity and the fragility of moral boundaries when group loyalty eclipses conscience. Over 18 months, 500 ordinary men from Reserve Police Battalion 101 murdered 83,000 people, most by point-blank shooting. Testimonies and court records confirm nearly all killings were voluntary. Only 10 to 12 men refused at Josefau, facing no punishment. The evidence shows how social pressure and conformity overwhelmed individual conscience, turning family men into mass murderers. Yet, many post-war defendants denied responsibility, claiming they had no choice. A claim debunked by official documents and trial verdicts. Some details remain unknown, including the full records of those who refused and the personal fates of every victim. But the main lesson is clear. Under certain conditions, ordinary people can commit extraordinary evil. Understanding how this transformation happened is essential, because history proves that the greatest danger is not fanaticism, but the willingness of ordinary people to obey and conform. That is the warning these documents leave behind.